Hi, I'm Lexi and this is Hannah and we're Wild About Conservation.
This is the podcast where we explore the world of conservation through discussions with our very knowledgeable guests. And this season's focus is on all things ocean.
In this episode, we chat to Melissa Costagliola-Ray, a researcher based at the University of Highlands and Islands in Thurso, Scotland. Our chat today focuses on seabirds, the differences between these ocean-dwelling animals and the birds that you see in your garden. Melissa's research focuses on refining monitoring methods for seabirds. We talk about her fieldwork, marine renewables and animal behaviour.
We have learned a lot chatting to Melissa today and appreciated the chance to learn more about these wonderful animals. We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast. Please remember to leave us a review, get in touch on Twitter, and if you'd like to support us as creators, we do actually have a Patreon. You can check out all of the links in the show notes on our website. So, enjoy! Hi, thank you for chatting to us today. So can you firstly introduce yourself to our listeners, who you are, what you do, and your key interest in conservation?
Hi Hannah, thank you very much to both of you for having me on. So I'm Melissa Costagliola-Ray. I'll say the whole thing just because some people trip over my last name. And I'm currently a PhD researcher and I'm based at the Environmental Research Institute, and that's in Thurso, and that's part of the University of Highlands and Islands. So my current work, I actually investigate the potential biases of traditional survey methods, and that's seabird survey methods. And in particular, I look at land-based vantage point surveys. So maybe just to tell you what land-based vantage point surveys are. So they're traditional land-based surveys carried out by an observer. And so the observer scans a survey area with either binoculars or a spotting scope, which is just a little telescope for bird spotting. And they're looking for seabirds and they pinpoint how many there are and where they are. And then these are used often to collect data for baseline assessments, so for environmental impact assessments. So for example, if we want to build something in the water, so if we want to put marine renewables in there, we have to carry out surveys to understand what animals use those environments. So I'm looking at improving these land-based survey methods.
Thank you so much for such a good introduction. But before we get to know you a little bit better and we get to go into all of your experiences, we do have a short game that we like to play with our guests. Mm-hmm. So it's a really fun round of some quick fire questions just to keep you on your toes, and it lets us get to know you a little bit better. So firstly, if you could be any animal, what would it be?
Oh, that's a hard one, and one that I actually think about quite often. I think as somebody that's into wildlife, you will often wonder what animal would you be? I think I'd have to be a bird. Maybe a guillemot. So these are cliff nesting seabirds that nest very high up, and they have one egg, and they're very, very sweet and do lots of diving and playing around in the water. I don't know, very, very cute and playful. So yeah, I would say a guillemot, common guillemot.
I love that answer. I am going to Google guillemots when I get off this call so that I can see what they look like too. Let me see. If you could fly, breathe underwater or hibernate, which would it be?
I would definitely say breathe underwater. I've done quite a bit of diving. I've been lucky to do some diving and I just love the marine environment. So I definitely love to breathe underwater and be able to see all the cool things that are swimming around in our oceans.
That's a curveball. I really thought you were going to say fly after the bird.
I know, it's hard. It's hard.
I thought that too.
But they're under the water though, so I get to see them when they dive down. Some of them.
Absolutely. And what is something that you love that has nothing to do with conservation?
Do you mean so wildlife related or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Nothing to do with conservation. That's a tough one. I'd actually say I'm currently starting to try and learn birdsong. So not just seabirds, but just what you'll hear in your outside in your garden, what you're likely to come across when you're going for a walk through the woods. What are those birds that are chirping away? So I'm currently trying to get my ear in and listen to lots of videos, and I'm using YouTube primarily just to try and learn those birds and to try and identify them without seeing them. So that's very hard, and I'm trying my best.
That is so tough. I did a couple of bird walks at uni with a professor pointing out the birds and the songs and repeating the noises. and I just don't have the ear for it. I'm not very musically inclined, so I just couldn't get there. My hat is off to you.
I'm trying my best. I'm not going to say I'm an expert, but I'm starting to learn anyway. So very, very amateur.
Yeah, I think I can listen to like maybe a robin, blackbird, starling, but they're like kind of my. Do seabirds have songs?
Yeah, so they all have different calls. I've not. I don't know if they're as distinct as different garden birds. It's definitely something you can learn. I mean, I was talking about oyster catchers, not a seabird, but like a wading bird. They're very, very distinct call. But seabirds, I suppose it's very difficult because they're in colonies. Quite often when we see them, they're at land breeding and they're in these huge numbers. So to try and pinpoint out one species and listen to it, that would be quite difficult.
Yeah, that's quite true, especially so many in the same
Mhm.
place. Before we completely dive down with the seabirds into everything about seabirds, every episode we ask our guest how they get wild about conservation. How do you get wild?
So I think I think it always, for everybody, has to start somewhere. So what got you into conservation? And I would say as a child, I don't know, I spent lots and lots of time out in nature. And I was very, very lucky to spend a great deal of time in nature. And it's very strange, but I've always had this fascination with water, particularly. So I've always been rooting through rock pools and having a little search, obviously making sure to put the rocks back afterwards, and just getting out there, and even pond dipping and everything like that. I've just had a fascination with, and it kind of just grew from there. So what is under the water has always really, really fascinated me. So then I think that's what got me into marine biology specifically.
I adore pond dipping. It's like my favorite activity.
I do love it.
And you get to an adult and people are like, sorry, there's not that much pond dipping about, and I'm like,
There is
please,
tons. Any
I want to
body
go
of
pond
water,
dipping.
just go. Yeah. I often went to like a local nature reserve. So it's not RSPB or anything, but a local nature reserve. And you could go into their little office that they had and you could just request, oh, please, can I have the pond dipping gear? So they'd give you a tray and the nets and an ID guide. And I just love that more than anything. I do miss it. I need to do it again soon.
There is nothing better than having that moment of curiosity when you start pond dipping and you're like, I don't know what I'm going to find, but I'm going to have a great time.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's the unknown, isn't it? What am I going to find? And then it's also the fun of IDing it as well afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mel, I have a question for you. You've mentioned that you've fallen in love with the ocean from when you were a child, but how did you go from like deep ocean pond dipping and things like that to a love of seabirds?
So I started off my journey, I suppose it's all kind of to do with education. So I started off, I did biology at college. I had a really inspiring female teacher there, and I was actually going to take geography at undergrad level, and she inspired me. I think my love of biology then overtook my love of geography. So then I started off doing biology at Sheffield University, and from there I just did biology. I decided, oh, I'm going to keep my options open. I'll just do biology, even though I've always had this marine love. I wasn't quite sure what to do, and I think as a child you're quite often told just to keep those options open. So I just did biology. So because I really wasn't sure, I didn't want to commit too far. So then I went on to do a marine biology master's because it was very, very clear that marine biology was my love and always was. So I needed to learn more about that marine environment. So then I did a master's at Bangor University. And from there, at the end of that, I did a project, and so that project was a dissertation project, and that was based on seabirds, and that's where it all started, really. So I spent the whole of the breeding season at a seabird colony, and that was the first time I'd ever been to a seabird colony, and it really does blow your mind. There's nothing like it. So from there, and watching them grow up, so the chicks, well, sorry, first the eggs been laid and then the chicks hatching. I even watched the chicks come out of the eggs, to then watching them being fed by the adults. I think just my love just really did. It was fixed then. So and then my love then for research then came in, actually, because I'm there carrying out the research, I'm finding out results, and just that whole process I then fell in love with. So I had to carry on and do more. So that's when I decided to do a PhD after that. So that's where I ended up now with my seabirds. Yeah.
I love that because it's It's funny, there's so many people I talk to that are either doing PhDs or did a master's, and like that's where it's usually you get the chance to focus on something and suddenly you become slightly obsessed. And yeah, I was the same. I was like marine biology and zoology, and my mum was like, "You're obsessed with the sea. Why are you not just doing
Yeah.
marine
Ah, so
biology?"
you did the same.
And
Similar.
yeah, so then I finally, well, I was already doing it a bit, but then I was like, okay, I will just focus now, rather than doing everything at once as usual. You mentioned obviously songbirds in our garden versus seabirds, and that they do sound different, but they all kind of still have potentially their same song. But what is a seabird versus just a bird
Yeah.
outside?
So that's a fantastic question, because I think quite often people don't think of them as two separate things. They just think of birds as birds, and they don't think of they don't distinguish. What is so that is a fantastic question. What makes them different? So seabirds, I think the clue is slightly in the name. So they're adapted to marine life, and they spend the majority of their life at sea. So they rely on the ocean for food, for everything. Apart from that one kind of time in their cycle where they return to land and they breed. So that's what they do. And I suppose they have quite a different. They've got lots of unique adaptations that help them live in the marine environment. So they have webbed feet to help them swim, and they have quite a few of the seabird species have salt glands, so to be able to get rid of that excess salt and effectively drink the ocean water. Now they've kind of got rid of that salt out of it. They're also waterproof, and they've got specialized feathers. So they've got quite a lot of feathers compared to their body. So compared to, say, the birds we find in our garden, they've got quite a few more feathers that makes them buoyant as well as being waterproof. Yeah, so those are all the few things that they have that make them specialized to live in the marine environment, or that I can think of off the top of my head.
Those are some really, really cool features. And on that note, I wanted to know, what is your favourite seabird?
Favorite seabird. So one of them I've already mentioned already. So that was the bird that I would be. So that's a common guillemot. And I can't commit to one. But I would have to say my favorite seabirds are common guillemots and razorbills. These are the two species I actually worked on in my master's. So these are cliff nesting seabirds. They're black and white, quite small. Often some people refer to them as like looking very much like penguins. They're not related to the penguin at all because they can fly, but they are very much penguin looking, and they breed on these steep cliffs, and have one egg and look after that egg until the chick fledges. So yeah, definitely. I'd say definitely need to Google what they look like, and also I'd encourage anyone to, if you don't know what they look like, also Google the eggs as well, because the eggs are a very, very cool shape. They're kind of like a pear shape, and it was thought that they were this shape to stop it rolling off the ledges, because they don't make any sort of nest. So these eggs are very precarious. They just kind of sit on them, so they have them on their feet. But they also very unique colours and patterns as well. So you really need to have a look at what these eggs look like.
Just thinking about kind of what you're saying about their eggs, and you mentioned that they're waterproof. Are all seabirds waterproof? I mean, you talk about that they breed on cliffs, but where do they live the rest of the time? Is it just away?
And so I will. So I will correct myself. Not all seabirds live on, breed on cliffs. So the guillemots and the razorbills, as I've mentioned, breed on the cliffs. But then we've got lots of other different ways that seabirds nest. Although they might not all make nests, we still call it nesting. So some dig burrows. So puffins you might know of, and Manx shearwaters. They dig their own burrows and they have their nests in there. Sorry, so what was the
Are all
question?
seabirds waterproof was my main question. And also, where do they
There we
go?
go.
Where
Yeah.
do they go when they're not nesting?
So, so no, not all seabirds are waterproof. The European shag, which is kind of close relative of the cormorants, these are black birds. You might have seen cormorants because they do come inland. So these are black birds, quite tall looking, quite large compared to when you're thinking about seabirds. These actually aren't waterproof. So they quite often you'll see them hanging out on a sunny day, so having their wings wide open, just trying to dry off. Yes, because they don't have that waterproof. But seabirds, as you said, we know quite a lot about seabirds when they come on land to breed, because that's when they're accessible to us. So if you think about what do they do in the whole of that rest of the time, they do go offshore. A lot less is known about seabirds within that time, but they do go offshore. And I know puffins, for example, spend a lot of time in large rafts. So they all get together and make this raft. And they often sleep in those rafts and spend quite a lot of time like that. But quite a few seabirds even sleep on the water. So, like I said, quite a lot less is known about them in that time, but they do just move offshore. But that isn't the case. I know it's quite hard. You can't pigeonhole all seabirds. Some seabirds, for example, Arctic terns, make that journey to the Arctic. So quite a few seabirds are migratory as well. So they don't just move off the shore. They do move to specific and different locations.
That sounds amazing, and I appreciated the pigeonhole pun there, whether
I
you
thought that
intended
too.
or not. So you've already mentioned the fact that you've been able to observe these birds and seeing some of the nests and seeing the babies hatch out of the eggs and how they look after each other and all of that, and it just sounds incredible. So can you pinpoint your favourite seabird moment and explain that for us?
Yes, that is a very difficult one, but also one I've thought about because I've actually heard that it comes up. I mean, I've not had it personally, but I've heard it comes up sometimes in job interviews. So, if you're looking for seabird jobs, so what's your favorite seabird moment? I think that's a really good question. I would have to say my favorite seabird moment was I was actually on a boat between John O'Groats and Orkney. So, this is in the far north of Scotland. And I was on a boat as it was part of Orca Watch, which is run by the Sea Watch Foundation. So this was back in 2019 because they weren't able to do it this year. And I was on this boat. I'll tell you why we were on the boat. But yes, we were on this boat and lots of gannets. So these are large birds, large seabirds with about a 2 meter wingspan, white with kind of a yellowish face and black wingtips. And they're very spectacular birds just because of the pure size of them. And they joined us in the wake of the boat and started diving next to the boat. And I've never had such a close interaction with such a large seabird. And just to have them diving and foraging right next to the boat was just I couldn't believe how close they were. But the reason we're on the boat actually in the first place was because it was part of Orca Watch, like I said, is coordinated by the Seabird Watch Foundation, and it's kind of a marine mammal recording event, but it's got a particular focus on orcas. So it happens annually, and I was just kind of taking part in that. But no, amazing experience.
Yeah, Melissa, you're certainly usually based up in the north of Scotland, and in a perfect place to go and see some unusual marine creatures visiting our shores. But
Very lucky.
I agree. If you like birds and you're in Scotland, some of the gannet colonies and opportunities to interact with gannets up here, I've definitely had one of my best experiences on Orkney. Just sat on a cliff, and they're so close. And then Bass Rock as well is a giant colony just outside of Edinburgh. So people listening going, I want to see a gannet. Scotland is your place.
If you're not in Scotland, because I'm not in Scotland currently, I'm in Manchester. And actually, before lockdown and everything, I visited a colony not all that far from here in the grand scheme of things. It's actually at Bempton Cliffs, and they have an incredible colony there. That's the only colony I've actually been to. I've not been to any of the Scottish ones yet. So, yeah, I would definitely recommend that.
There's always time to visit more colonies.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think, Melissa, next time I see you, we need to go visit one of those colonies.
That would be fantastic.
I have a flip side question, actually, on what is your favourite seabird moment? What is your least favourite seabird moment? Like, has a seabird ever thrown up on you or, dropped a dead fish on you? What has been your least favourite seabird moment? Lexi is squinting her face right now.
No, thank you.
Quite a lot of seabird researchers that tag birds and have very, very close contact would have lots of those fantastic stories. Unfortunately, because I'm a land-based researcher looking at them kind of doing what they do, I suppose, foraging, and everything else that goes along with that, and I'm just recording them from a distance, I don't have any fantastically wonderful stories like that. But I have had a close shave where I was just on a walk, not particularly looking for seabirds. I mean, I always have my binoculars with me anyway, and a cormorant, which is those big blackbirds that I mentioned previously, was flying overhead and decided to defecate, and it was very, very close to shave. I saw it happen though, so I was able to stop walking, and it just landed next to me. But I don't think I have any bad moments. I suppose it's just comical, isn't it?
Would you still count that as lucky, even though you stopped it from happening?
Yeah, I was just thinking,
Like,
because that's
from
supposed to be lucky, isn't it, when you
falling
get
on you?
pooped on?
I suppose maybe I should have carried on walking.
But then would it be lucky if you made it happen? Oh, the
I'm
questions
just
of the
thinking about
universe.
seagulls stealing my ice cream, and that my niece was like,
Oh yes,
"Did you
yeah.
remember when that seagull stole your ice
I have
cream?"
had one with gulls, yeah. So just probably one of those generic ones that everybody has. Just a gull swooping down while I was crossing the road with fish and chips. Yes, and
No.
I didn't drop any though, so it was okay. But I suppose they're only doing what they need to do.
I mean, it's fair game when food's about, to be honest, for humans and
Lexi,
for
the secret
gulls,
seagull.
so you can't blame them. I mean, I have many secrets. Why can't that be one of them? Right, we're going way off on a tangent here. Melissa, have you ever worked with any other species or groups of birds, or is it just seabirds? Are you like a one group of bird gal?
So I suppose professionally, I've only worked with seabirds, but outside of that, in anything else that I just take up because I want to, it's like a hobby, I suppose. I've helped with webs counts, so those are wetland bird surveys. So I've not done them myself, but I have helped aid in those surveys, and those are surveys that anyone can do if you're interested in or not just sorry, not seabirds, any birds, a bird watcher. You can. It's part of it's a British Trust for Ornithology. You can just sign up, and it's monthly winter wetland bird counts, and you just go out to a local wetland near you, count the birds, and submit that data to them. So I've helped out with those. I also yearly, I don't know if you've heard of it, I've carried out also taken part in the Big Garden Bird Watch. So that's the RSPB kind of wildlife citizen science project. So it's coordinated by RSPB, and all you have to do, anyone, members of the public, if you're interested, just spend an hour having a look in your garden, and you just track what birds you get in your garden at that time. And so all you submit is the highest number of birds that you've seen within that hour, nice and easy. And that would just really help. It just helps build up a picture of the whole UK, really, and increases our understanding of specific challenges that might be faced by wildlife.
And I think on that note, actually, about the Big Garden Birdwatch as well, is that you don't even have to have a garden, technically. You could go
You
sit
don't.
in
That
the
very good.
woodland or something nearby.
You can go to a local park. You really don't need to have your own garden. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I meant to say that.
I wish I had a garden.
I think I've even heard of people doing next door's garden. So if you don't have your own garden, I've heard of people going up in say maybe if they have a balcony, if you're lucky, or even just your upstairs window, and have been recording next doors. But I wouldn't maybe advocate that. They might not be happy that you've stolen it from them.
Yeah, that's quite next level involvement. But yeah,
Or a really great way to get to know your neighbours. Just a little knock on the door, like, "Hey, could we survey
I
your
suppose,
garden?
yeah,
Because
definitely
we
ask
don't have one."
beforehand.
No, thank you for highlighting some of those like projects and ways to get involved, because I think that's one thing that we really advocate here on this podcast is not only learning but also engaging with the wilderness that is around us and the wonderful world that we live in. So we're getting on to our main topic now: seabirds. Are there like broad groups or broad types of seabirds, or do we just have seabirds?
Yeah, so there's quite a few different groups, broad groups anyway. So I suppose just to start off, an easy one would be penguins. Quite a lot of people might not think of penguins as seabirds, but they are. So that's one group. So for those of you that don't know what penguins are, I'm quite sure that you will do, but they're flightless birds. And then we have auks. So these are some that I've already talked about, including the common guillemots and razorbills, also includes the puffins. And these are kind of small to medium sized seabirds. And they're kind of like barrel shapes. They've got very short tails, very small wings, and short legs. So I suppose maybe that's why I describe myself as a common guillemot, because that kind of describes me. Um, and these auks, they fly quite low and they flap their wings quite manically, and they have poor maneuverability. But they're as soon as they enter that marine environment, they're excellent swimmers and divers, and they actually pursue their prey underwater. Which, if it's very clear water, sometimes you can see that, and that's quite amazing to see. Another group is the boobies and the gannets. So I've already mentioned the gannets, and these feed by diving from quite a height sometimes for fish. And the only species of that group that we have is the northern gannet, and those are the white birds that I mentioned with the black tips and the kind of yellowy heads. And other types actually that aren't in the UK are kind of tropical birds within that boobies and gannets group, and those include the frigate birds as well, like I said, and the boobies. And these breed in colonies on cliffs and islands, and some of the tropical species actually even nest in the trees, which I couldn't think of what species that did nest in trees, but I think that's quite amazing. I think some of them even balance an egg between like branches and things. And another group is the cormorants and shags. So I've mentioned cormorants and the shags as well, the ones that aren't waterproof. So they're long-bodied and quite large tails and the broad wings and long necks. That's why I said they were quite a long bird. And they've got short, thick legs. And they also have bills with a kind of a hook on the end, and that just helps them grasp the fish while they're diving under the water. Another kind of group we've kind of mentioned is gulls, and in with the gulls we also have terns. So we've got the gulls, kind of iconic birds that everybody kind of knows. So I think everyone has the most contact with gulls out of all the seabirds, I suppose. And so gulls are the small to large seabirds. They come inland for quite a lot of the year, but some gulls are strictly marine birds. So they're mostly grey and black and white when they're fully mature. But then when they're immature, they're kind of like lots of shades of brown, and you wouldn't think they're a gull actually if you've not got your eye in there. And terns are quite like gulls, but they're small to medium birds. They're often smaller and slimmer, so they're quite dainty little birds compared to the gulls. And these are the seabirds that are often quite migratory. And some of those are, so for example, the Arctic tern, common tern, and the sandwich tern as well. And I've got to see those out in the field. Sometimes they can be very, very hard to distinguish between them as if you've not got quite close views of them. Another group is the petrels and the shearwaters, and these are seabirds that are actually related to albatrosses. And they share kind of a peculiar arrangement of nostrils, giving them kind of an alternative name. They're known as the tube noses. And these birds are strictly marine. They come ashore to breed in burrows, and they only return to land under the cover of darkness. But that's not true of all of the petrels and shearwaters. One of petrels and shearwaters that you might have contact with quite often if you're looking for seabirds in the UK is the northern fulmar, and these actually nest on open ledges rather than burrows. And then we have quite a few groups. Skuas. So these are in the same group as the gulls and terns, and they're actually sometimes known as the pirates of the sky because they gain quite a lot of their food by stealing it from other seabirds, quite often in flight as well. So that can be quite a spectacle, although you do feel sorry for the bird that's been stolen from. And we also have then sea ducks as well. Quite a lot of people think about ducks as not marine birds at all, but we do have some species of sea ducks. And they spend the majority of their non-breeding season in the marine environment. And we also have divers. These have long, slender bodies. As some examples of divers are the great northern diver, red-throated diver, and the black-throated diver, and they're the only three species of diver that we have in the UK. And lastly, we have grebes. Some people might not think that those grebes go in the marine environment as well, but we do have some grebes that go in the marine environment.
That was an incredible whistle-stop tour of seabirds, and I am impressed but also a little bit overwhelmed. Like, I just want to sit here and look at pictures, so you may have to send us some for our website.
Yes, yeah, I do have some pictures.
Oh, excellent. So whilst we're on the topic of birds and seabirds, how many seabird species do we actually have here in the UK?
I'm sure that we have 25 species in the UK. And they're from all of those, well, not all of those different groups, but quite a lot of those different groups. So we're quite lucky in the UK because Britain and Ireland actually have globally important breeding numbers of seabirds spread across those 25 species. I think there's about a total of 8 million birds that breed in Britain and Ireland. So quite a number. And you wouldn't think so. I think quite a lot of, I don't know, before I got into seabirds, I didn't really know much about them and had no idea what we had on our coastlines until you go and look, and then you're blown away by how many there actually are. Because I think when you go to a seabird colony in particular, you can see quite a lot of species at one time. If you go, say, in the breeding season, you're not just going to see one bird, you can see maybe 4 or 5 species in one day. So yeah, we're very, very lucky in the UK to have that breadth of species and number as well.
Yeah, you just got me thinking about kind of the different birds that we've got, and there is no such thing as a seagull, is there? Like an actual seagull.
No, that's very correct. So I think previously in the podcast I just mentioned when I spoke about gulls, so it's the term gull rather than seagull. So gulls represent lots of different species, I suppose. So we have like herring gull and so many lesser blackback gull, greater blackback gull, just off the top of my head. So there's lots of different species that make up that group that everyone kind of turns seagull.
And in terms of all of these different groups, obviously we know from what you said earlier that most of your work is looking at previously kind of nesting, but also foraging and how adults feed their chicks and how they use birds in general use marine space. So you've touched on it briefly that, for example, the gannets dive from really great heights, but are there really different feeding strategies, or are they all quite similar?
Yeah, so I think there's about 3 different types, mainly that people split seabirds into these 3 different feeding strategies. So you've got surface feeders, so they collect items that are floating on the surface, or swimming kind of at the surface. So, for example, if fish are swimming quite close to the surface, or different prey items, all they would need to do is just dip their heads under the surface. And gulls do this, and so do fulmar. Another strategy is called plunge diving. So this is where birds can fall from quite impressive heights actually and dive into the water to obtain their food. That's swimming below the surface and not at the surface like the surface feeders. And so gannets are ones that are known to do this, and they're quite spectacular. So they'll be flying normally with their wings outstretched, and they'll just suddenly tuck their wings in and really nosedive. So they look a bit like Concorde, I don't know, hitting the water. And another one is diving from the surface. So they'll just be sitting on the water surface and then just dive from that position on the water. So there's birds that dive from the surface, and there's 2 different groups within this. There's birds that are wing propelled, so they use their wings under the water to help them move. So yeah, kind of swimming through the water with their wings. And the other ones are foot propelled, so they kind of use their feet for that movement under the water.
Are there any birds that use both wings and feet?
That's a very good question. I would say probably, yeah. But kind of within kind of how they're classified, they are split very much. But yeah, I don't see why not. I kind of want to Google that
I
now.
know, I was just thinking that.
I was like, surely for efficiency, but it's evolution and how they've adapted and stuff. So you also mentioned breeding season and how it's a great time for some people to see these birds. What is breeding season in the sense of time? Like, is it the same for all of the species, or is it at different times of year you'll see different species of seabird?
So I would say that they are broadly similar. They have slight differences, but if you want to go and look for seabirds, I'd say that the best time is between April and June. And if you're wanting to get into seabird watching, kind of how I started off, because it's like, where do you go? What I would kind of suggest to people is what I do, because I don't know anything else, I suppose, is I just have a look. I started by having a look on the RSPB website and just having a look at what locations they have close to me and what birds I can see at each of those locations. They also split it out by kind of what month you can, month by month or season by season, what you can see at these different kind of RSPB sites. So that is a great place to start, because you might have a seabird colony on your doorstep that you don't know about. If you just have a look on that RSPB site, it could just be there. So that's a great place to start.
And okay, we've gone into all of our different seabirds and kind of how we define them, what they're doing. But why are seabirds like so important to our environment? What role do they play in the marine environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So seabirds are often used as indicators of kind of marine ecosystem health. So because seabirds respond quite quickly to environmental changes, and they're easily detected, kind of easy to identify and survey, and you can survey them across kind of large areas. So if you see something happening with seabirds, it's quite often telling of the marine environment, which is very, very useful because they're, like I said, quite easy to monitor. So seabirds are also top predators in the marine food chain, and they're a key component of the food web. So I suppose if you took them away, what would happen kind of in between? You're not getting that kind of level by level within the environment. So quite a lot of people might not know this about seabirds, but they actually play a key role in cycling nutrients. So they travel hundreds of kilometers, they feed out in the ocean, and then they come back in the breeding season and they poo. Um, and this is often called within science guano. And so these droppings at the colony, they can leach out into the ocean and they can fertilize nearby communities such as coral reefs. And they also do this for land, so terrestrial systems as well. So if they poo on land, then they're fertilizing the soil and they can enhance local plant growth. So that's an interesting one as well for seabirds.
Yeah, I hadn't really realized that before because I think in the tropics that guano is super important to some of those terrestrial communities that you said. And I know that is it one of the ways that you can identify like a seabird cliff is if it's stained white? Because I think Bass Rock
Yeah.
near outside Edinburgh again, the whole island, you can actually see how white it is from Edinburgh.
Yeah. So before the gannets will get there to Bass Rock, it'll be so brown, and then they arrive and start pooing, and then it just turns white. Yeah, so you can always see if you're maybe going before or after after the breeding season, you can see exactly what ledges they've been on because yeah, all the whites left over.
It's quite cool though.
It is very cool.
Something interesting as well with seabirds that I think has been studied, I've read about recently, is so they're ingesting plastics more and more. As we all know, plastics are a large problem in the marine environment, and seabirds actually ingest these plastics. And then I've seen some research looking at so when they defecate, what does that mean for the say plant environment? So they're ingesting these plastics. What toxic things are in those plastics? And then how is that going to influence the plant communities afterwards as well?
That's a really interesting research question. Do you have any answers yet? Or have you read anything that you know about?
If you want to have a look, a colleague of mine or a previous colleague of mine, Megan Grant, has a recent paper on that.
Thank you for the tip. But once you've already got to the topic before we managed to ask you, what are some of the other pressures and threats that seabirds face?
So one of the ones that I'm predominantly looking at is marine renewables and how they might be influencing seabirds and not just their distributions, but so you have when you're introducing marine renewables into the environment, the ones that I look at are tidal stream turbines, and these are turbines that are fixed to the seabed and they have a rotor, and that's driven by the currents. And so you then when you introduce any rotor into environment, you have collision risks. So are those birds at risk the collision with those, or are they able to kind of navigate around them? But that's something we don't know. And are they also displaced from these environments? So does the noise and all of that, does that mean that they just stop using those environments? Or do these renewables kind of draw the seabirds in? So these structures might act as coral reefs. They might they might be kind of places where fish can come and seek shelter or kind of avoid predators. So you might have more and more fish, which then would actually attract the seabirds to these potentially dangerous places for them. But aside from marine renewables, I suppose another one of those is offshore marine renewables, so offshore wind turbines. And we're starting to get more of a grasp on what those might mean for seabirds. But then we also have, like I've mentioned, plastics and oil, kind of like oil slicks, and I'll just have a think. Yeah, so there's actually quite a few more. So invasive species, obviously, they can have quite an impact because they can predate nests. So they can eat the eggs, they can eat the chicks, and there's quite a lot of kind of mouse or rat eradication programs throughout seabird research, just trying to get those off islands. So these ground nesting birds um, aren't at risk. And then we also have overfishing. So all the prey for the seabirds might be decimated really. And then within that as well, the fishing, you could have accidental bycatch. So you have these like long line fishing with the hooks on it, quite often baited hooks, and these seabirds can accidentally get caught on these and unfortunately die. Um, and also climate change and human disturbance generally as well. So we're not just using the marine environment for renewables, but we're also using it for aquaculture. So raising fish for us to eat. And so we don't know as well. That's something that's a growing research as well. What impact does that have on seabirds as well?
Yeah, I think you've highlighted uh, all of the main threats there, and I think it's really important to just take a moment and take stock, because I don't work with birds and I'm not that clued up on them, but just that second when you were like invasive species, like of course you have this idea in your mind that birds can just fly away, but that's not the case if they're nesting and breeding on some of these
Mm.
grounds. And that's the same thing, like we are trying with marine renewables, which is great in one sense, but the threats that we're causing are ubiquitous globally. So it's really not nice, but important, I
Mhm.
think, to lay out all of the problems that in the way that you just have, because I think it gives a much broader picture of like, it's not, we can't just save one area, we can't just improve Bass Rock and then the entire population is going to be fine. I mean, that would help, but there are so many problems that it is a much wider
Mm.
solution,
Definitely.
I
I think
think.
more and more people are starting to realize that we can't just think about overfishing and then we can't just think about pollution. You need to think about all of those together because seabirds move. So they're not just going to have that one impact. So these are called kind of like cumulative impacts. So when you start thinking about all the different impacts and kind of adding them together, and kind of what can you do to tackle it as a whole, to start reducing these risks? Because I suppose it's about reducing risk. Because like we're saying about renewables, it's a really good way to go. But it's just about doing it safely. I'm no way saying that we shouldn't do renewables. It's just doing it in a safe way, and just about understanding how seabirds use those environments so we can really help reduce those risks.
And I think that's great to pick up on, because I've picked up on two things you said there, that just from a comment point of view, that it's quite interesting in the UK because we don't necessarily view invasive species in the same way that a country like New Zealand or Australia would. And it's interesting, I think, how, I mean, we've had some bad terrestrial diseases in the past, like mad cow's disease, and it was quite normal to see kind of these disinfectant footpads everywhere at the time. But I know for a fact when I go to, say, the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, they have footpads to stop people introducing an invasive seed or anything into the gardens. And the number of people you see step over them because people don't understand that kind of biosecurity, because we just don't have the same level of awareness of it in the UK. But actually, what I was going to say was you've made a real good link there, because we're talking about obviously the importance of data and good data to help us put marine renewables in the most appropriate place where we're going to have the least impact, because at the end of the day, that is what data and management is helping us do. And you are working to refine those methods to collect that data. So you've made such a great point there, and I had to like bring it all together in one sentence. And I am getting very excited to just dive even deeper into Mel's work. So two different strands to your research. Obviously, there's the quantification of seabird use that you've mentioned before of tidal environments, which is kind of what you're working on now. And then more previously, you were working on the provisioning of food to chicks, which I guess they both overlap a fair amount.
Yeah, so they do overlap to some extent, I suppose, because in my masters I was looking at these two species, guillemots, common guillemots, and razorbills, and so what were they feeding to their chicks? How much were they feeding? How often were they feeding? What species were they feeding? How how large were the species they were feeding? Um, and then how did that change over time of day? How did it change over the breeding season? And did it relate to the tides, so the tidal cycle? Did it relate to that? So that's all information that we kind of need to know when thinking about the possible risks to seabirds. I mean, it would have also been great if I knew where they were feeding, really to tie that in, but that wasn't something I could collect. And I actually did my master's data collection at South Stack, which is an RSPB reserve in Wales in Anglesey. And off the shore from this very, very large seabird colony, it's actually been proposed to be a tidal demonstration site, so for tidal stream turbines. And so it's great to understand what are the seabirds doing, what are they eating, to be able to know, hopefully. So if we do, say, collection of fish in the area, we might have a better idea of where they actually might be foraging to help maybe influence where these renewables might be able to go in the future. So I suppose my research did kind of link to renewables then, not as much as I hoped because I couldn't collect the data of where the birds were going. And then my research now looking at refining methods of how to assess the seabirds. So I should probably tell you a bit about what tidal stream environments are. What does it mean? So they occur primarily in tidal passes found between land masses around shallow headlands. And these environments are actually highly energetic as the water is constricted between these land masses. And the currents are actually accelerated. Therefore, these environments are particularly suitable for energy extraction because we have that high water flow going through. And in particular, like I mentioned, tidal stream turbine developments. And like I've mentioned, these are turbines that are fixed to the seabed with a rotor. But not all are fixed to the seabed, but those are the main ones that are being used at the moment. And these are actually also important sites for seabirds because these turbulent waters mean that prey is often confused and kind of disorientated, which means that seabirds can quite easily pick off the prey. But also because they're more shallow, the water is uplifted, and so with the uplift of the water, you also get the uplift of the prey, and this also makes it easier for seabirds. So as well as being really, really good environments for renewable energy, they're also targeted specifically by seabirds. So we automatically know that there is likely to be an interaction between the two. So then I'm kind of going on to look at how we survey these seabirds.
That sounds really, really interesting. I didn't realise that, like you said, the water increases in speed, which creates these obviously great spaces for renewable energy, but also these great feeding grounds.
It makes it a bit like a conveyor belt. So the prey's been passed through and they can just pick it off. I mean, it's not that easy, but yeah, easier.
But in terms of like catching prey out in the open ocean, if there's an easier space, you just would, which is why gulls take fish and chips. Anyway, so what are the different behaviours that you're seeing and monitoring? What are you looking for?
So because I'm actually looking at how we monitor seabirds and how those methods can be improved. I'm just doing these land-based surveys and kind of taking down everything that's happening. So I kind of record what species are in the area, what they're doing. So are they just passing through, or are they diving from this? Like we've mentioned, the different foraging strategies. So diving from the air, diving from the water, just plucking from the surface. What kind of foraging strategy are they doing, and how many are in the area? So then that builds up an idea of how are they using the environments, so then we can better place renewables. But I'm also looking at, so I'm bringing in other methods. So I'm also using drones, because we have these traditional survey methods and we have problems. So as a land-based observer, your ability to detect a seabird decreases with distance. So we need to understand how that might influence how many birds we are saying are using this environment. So we need to better understand what that influence of distance has on our ability to tell developers how important the site is for seabirds. And then we also have things like sea state, so how rough the water is, and how that might influence our ability to see the seabirds and count them and see what they're doing. As well as weather conditions, they also impact the ability of an observer to do that job. So it's just kind of, I'm bringing all this together, hopefully. So I'm also using two observers. So to see if that two observers can help us understand kind of what's happening with that distance and how that's influencing how many birds we are seeing. Because if you use two observers, it's very it's very hard to explain. So hopefully using these two observers can make us understand how the distance is um, influencing how many birds we're seeing. And then I'm also bringing in other methods, so drones. So drones are starting to be used in wildlife monitoring more and more, but it's very, very important to understand how these new techniques relate to this long-standing data sets that we have. So we have these data sets, and we've used land-based surveys since the beginning of seabird monitoring when we want to build something in the environment. But how does this new data set compare to that? And can we start using it? Is it a viable option? And does it give us similar things to the traditional methods? Or can it give us something extra as well? And how can we maybe use the two together to understand really at a fine scale how seabirds are using these environments?
Yeah, I think you explained that really well, because there's always going to be a little bit of human error.
Mm,
And I wouldn't have even taken into consideration the weather, which obviously impacts things. Um, so yeah, as you've said, more eyes basically are better than more sets of eyes are better than one. And I think the use of technology makes sense to me. Have you found the use of drones and technology and increasing that side of it beneficial yet?
yeah, so that's something that I'm trying to work on a manuscript at the moment. Actually, I'm starting to see real results, which is very exciting. So in terms of the two methods, so using vantage points and using drones, the drones seem to be able to give us a better understanding of the habitat use. So where are they actually foraging? Because the vantage point surveys give us a very kind of graded way of the positional data, I suppose. So the positional data gained from vantage points is very sparse. You can only tell whether a bird's foraging within 100 meters rather than the very, very accurate positional fixes that are given from drones. So we can use drones maybe to answer the questions of is the overlap with where they're foraging likely to be where we want to put the renewables, whereas the species identification is a lot better from a land-based observer. So the land-based observers, from the data that I'm looking at, saw more species than the drone, and land-based observers are better at IDing the birds than the drone. I think that's maybe because you have, I don't know, I think it's the video that kind of clarity and how you're able to identify those birds possibly, or it might be the fact that as a land-based observer you have like a better overview of the whole survey area, whereas the drone is kind of a very, very fixed point in space. So it's very, very interesting that, and the numbers as well that I've seen between two. So I was looking at two groups. I was looking at um, auks and I was looking at terns, which are those kind of dainty gull-looking birds. Sorry, gull but in dainty form. Um, so they're surface foraging birds and they're white, and the auks are diving birds and they are dark colours. So the number of birds picked up by the vantage point and the drone was closer when you have those white surface foraging birds. The numbers that were seen were closer than when we were comparing the diving birds, the dark birds, and those were more different, the numbers. So that's really, really interesting.
Mm. And what do the birds actually think of your drone? Because I mean, it's in their aerial space, and I've seen birds, well, especially raptors. take a fancy to a drone in the sky. So yeah, is that changing their behaviour at all? Is that something you have to mitigate against?
It's definitely something you have to think about, because we want to see what they do naturally, so, and that's what we want to record. So we don't want to have any influence on what they're doing. So we make sure to fly very, very high. So before even going near the birds, so from where the drone pilot, which isn't me, I'm not qualified. So yeah, the drone pilot, it just goes straight up from the drone pilot and then over the survey area. So it's not going across then up, if that makes sense. So it's just going straight up and over. So I think we flew between 60 and 70 meters. I think it was maybe more like 70 meters above the water, and they didn't seem to have any. They didn't seem to notice it at all, the drone, and that's what we want, because we want to see what they're doing naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to get another kind of overview of what fieldwork looks like for you. So you've got a drone pilot, you've got yourself, you've got a second observer, how long you're out there for, what does it feel like, how many layers
I
do
was
you have
just
to
thinking
wear?
that.
Just describe your fieldwork.
I'm quite a cold person, so I wear lots and lots of layers. I'd rather have more and strip off than have too little. So I usually wear about maybe 5 or 6 on the top and 3 on the bottom, something like that. And that's just normal for me: hat, scarf, gloves, snood, everything. But it was actually the fieldwork that I did was actually at Stramford Loch in Ireland, and the weather while we were there was actually rather warm for most of it, so we were very, very lucky. Um, and in terms of what's the fieldwork like, so because we were flying the drone with the land-based surveys, we actually needed good weather conditions. So it was actually quite nice for us as land-based observers, because we couldn't go out, we couldn't fly the drone in the rain, and also the wind couldn't be too high. Yeah, so it's kind of nicer conditions for a land-based observer. Yeah, and we're not out for. It depends on the weather windows, and not normally with land-based observers. Kind of just going out on your own, you're less limited to weather conditions. But with the drone, we could only target those kind of weather windows that were suitable. So if it was a nice weather window all day, we would really try and make the most of it. We'd try and, but then you're limited on the drone battery, I suppose. So we were just out as long as we possibly could, and then go back, quickly recharge everything, and go back out again in the afternoon. But we were also trying to target specific tidal states. So that also kind of meant that we weren't out for long periods of time as well, because we were trying to cover the tidal cycle when doing the field work. But when I was doing my master's field work, that was a very different story. So I wanted to hit different times of day, and then I was covering the tidal state naturally because I was just out there so much. So I was out for 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in midday, 3 hours in the evening, every day for the breeding season, which I absolutely loved. You get very, very tired, but it's that tiredness that it's accomplishment. I've been out and I've accomplished something. It's that great sort of tiredness.
I love that. And having joined you on those surveys, Melissa, it was amazing. It was just lovely, and even when it was very windy, hiding behind the rocks.
Yes, which it was.
Um,
But it'd be funny because it'd be a sunny, glorious day. Everyone's in shorts and t-shirts, and I'm there in a full-on coat snood. Because you're just stood there for so long, you do get cold, even though it's a glorious day. So everyone's like, why are you so wrapped up? I'm like, because I've been here for hours.
Especially if you're a cold person as well. I'm the same. I go out for a walk at the moment and still have about 3 coats
Yeah.
on. So I feel, yeah.
I mean, that's
absolutely.
pretty much what I wore to work yesterday. When you were like, I've got this many layers on top and this many on the bottom, I was like, yeah, I think I actually had that on, and I was indoors. But something I actually wanted to ask was, you've kind of mentioned how you're aiming for the different tide states because obviously it can affect the observer's data. But does tide state, I mean, I know season will probably change bird behaviour because they may or may not actually be around, but does tide state or time of day or weather, do the birds just pack up their bags and say, I don't feel like it today? Because obviously, at the end of the day, they need to feed. So yeah, does that change their behaviour, or is it just your ability to monitor it?
There's usually peaks in seabird activity. So usually dawn and in the evening. So that's why for my master's research, I was trying to hit those time frames just to try and get as much data as possible. In terms of weather, I don't think so, not that I've seen. And the only time of day as well, it's obviously night because seabirds are visual hunters, so they need that daylight. So yeah, in the night they won't usually feed. Um, but yeah, I think they have to go out in all weathers like we do to monitor them.
Do we have any nocturnal seabirds?
We do, but I would have to Google it.
That's fine. That's something we can think about later.
So you've painted a really nice, warm, cozy picture of your fieldwork for us. Thank you for that. What does a day in your normal life look like as a researcher?
So that would depend very much on kind of where I'm at with a different piece of work, I suppose, because I could spend days reading the relevant literature to understand kind of what's been carried out previously, and then how am I going to like build on that or improve that, for example, or just to understand the background of what seabirds are doing in these environments before I then go on and try and improve monitoring methods. Um, but then some days I can be looking at data or drone pictures as well that I've collected and trying to look for birds on the pictures and trying to ID those. And then that can vary greatly to then out in the field all day. So I very much do different things on different days depending on where I'm at with my work. But I love that variety. It's great, and that's what I think I love about research.
I adore that because, yeah, it's such a varied day, I imagine, as you've just said, of everything you get up to, depending on what you're doing. And you have summarized this really well several times throughout the podcast, but I'm going to ask you to put it all together just as a nice little summary as we're wrapping up towards the end. So how is your data actually going to be used, do you think, by industry or other groups that manage the marine environment? And I know you said you're preparing a paper at the moment, and I imagine kind of a lot of your work is still yet to come, but what are the expected outcomes of your research in general?
So my work in a nutshell aims to kind of understand the biases with traditional land-based methods for seabird monitoring, and to pinpoint those biases and trying to work on those. So firstly, the distance decay. So our ability to detect seabirds decreases with distance. How can we mitigate that? How can we better understand how that influences abundances? And then how does that then feed into collision risk modeling and other types of modeling for marine renewables?
Yeah, that accurate data is so important. And I am a lover of a good methodology development project. But yeah, I mean, Lexi, do you have any more questions on Melissa's research, or shall we dive in a little bit more about how people can get wild about seabirds?
You know me, I am here for the engagement factor of this podcast. I love hearing about the nitty-gritty of people's research, but it's about time we started talking about how people could get involved. So, firstly, if you have one, Melissa, what's your coolest seabird fact?
Oh, I have two, if that's okay.
Okay, I'm into it. Double the answer, I'm here for it.
It's the first one is to do with gannets and how they dive. So that diving from a great height. So gannets can dive or usually dive from a heights of about 30 meters and can hit the water at speeds of 60 miles per hour when fishing. So they've actually, in order to be able to do this, they have an extensive network of air sacs which help cushion them, like the impact to their muscles. So that like allows them to do this deep diving behavior from such a great height.
I am stressed already thinking about it. Like, I'm happy they can do it and they
They're
survive,
flying
but
airbags.
So my second one is actually that some seabirds have unique defense mechanisms to help protect themselves from predators. And one of these in particular is that I wanted to tell you about was the northern fulmar. And this is actually to defend themselves and their nests from predators. Fulmars produce a stomach oil, which is they eject when they're threatened. And they use this when they're scared, when they're threatened, and the oil can actually solidify to mat wing feathers, or to repulse predators, because it's extremely offensively smelling. Apparently, I've not smelt it myself. And the smell of the oil can't be removed with water and can persist on items of clothing for months or even years afterwards. So I've heard this from many seabird researchers. They just have to throw their clothes away.
Oh, no.
So I'm going to say the first one was a cool fact. The second one was a gross fact, but I'm into them both.
But the cool bit about the second one is that although the oil is used as a defense mechanism, it's also used as an energy reserve that they can provide to their chicks if they're struggling to forage.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Lexi said, that they were great seabird facts. But I think it's like a skunk, isn't it? You just never get that smell or stain out ever. And I'll ask a more specific question. Melissa, do I need specialist equipment to go and interact with seabirds, or can I just take my eyeballs?
I would definitely say that you don't need to have any specialist equipment at all to watch seabirds, which I think makes it accessible to everybody. I would recommend a trusty set of binoculars, just because I take them everywhere with me. But saying that, at quite a lot of seabird colonies, especially any RSPB site you go to, the paths that they have laid out, you can get so close without leaving any paths and doing it safely and without any kit. But I suppose one piece of kit, depending on where you live, that might be essential, is a car. And that's
a good point.
Yeah. But having said that, even in lockdown, I've seen seabirds, and I'm currently in Manchester. And I've not travelled anywhere apart from like 15 minutes around my house, and I've been to canals and just reservoirs as well, and I've seen cormorants. So you really don't need to travel as far as you think.
And on that topic, what would be the etiquette for seabird watching? As you've just said, if you're at an RSPB site, don't leave the paths. It's not actually necessary. But if you head down to the beach, what would
I
you
would
suggest?
say, like you said, avoid getting too close to birds because you don't want to disturb them or any of the habitat that they rely upon. Also, sticking to roads, paths where they exist. Just avoid as much disturbance as you can, because I suppose you're there to watch them and you want to see them doing their thing. So if you're disturbing them, they're going to be maybe alarm calling or flying away, and that's not what you want as a seabird watcher anyway, is it? So and another big one, actually, I would just leave it as you found it. Don't leave any litter. Take all your litter home with you. Even take extra. If you see any extra, feel free to take that with you home and recycle it at home, I would say.
Always a good tip. And everyone's got hand sanitizer now anyway, so pick it up, put it in the bin, clean your hands, you'll be grand.
And you'll make the marine environment that bit happier.
Exactly.
If you could measure its happiness. Everyone has a phone, pretty much. Is there any ID guides that you can get on the phone that you use, or do you take books with you, or those cute little pamphlets that I adore where they're like 3 pieces of paper folded up and laminated? They're fantastic. So yeah, do you have an ID guide that's your go-to?
I do. I have a book, and it's just one book that I use for the majority, really. It's my go-to, and lots of people told me it's their go-to, and it's been recommended to me over and over. And this is the Collins Bird Guide, and it's called The Most Complete Bird Guide to the Birds of Britain and Europe. I have the second edition. I think that might be the most recent, and I believe it's only about £14, which I think is a bargain because I can't live without it, and I've even bought one for my mum. So
I adore when we can get our family and to me, it's my mum especially, passionate about all of our things as well. I got shampoo bars recently, and my mum's like, "Can you send me one?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure. I'll introduce you to shampoo bars."
I love shampoo bars.
So yeah, I love the fact that your mum, other than a shampoo bar, has also potentially got the book.
But in terms of apps that you were saying, there is a good bird ID kind of app that I would recommend. I've never paid for an app in my life, and there's no need to, I would say, when you're thinking about getting into bird ID and all of that, because there's so many free ones out there. It's called Bird ID, which I know isn't helpful, but this app was created by Nord University. So I think if you type in Bird ID Nord University, that would help you find it. And it's got kind of an ID section, which is very, very detailed for not just seabirds but all birds. and it tells you identifying features. You can listen to the calls, you can see pictures, and it's got little arrows, like I said, to identifying features, which is great. But what I love about this app is that you can do training quizzes. So you can pick whether to just look at pictures or just sounds if you're feeling a challenge, or you can do both. So pictures and sounds together. And I'm a very very visual learner, so I find it great.
I love that you just mentioned this app that has the bird calls, because one of the most frustrating things is you hear a bird and you're like, what is that? Or is that even a bird? So that sounds like it would be super useful. And is there any other apps other than that one? Because that sounds great.
Yeah, actually, it's one related to bird calls, and it's called BirdNet, and this is created by Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And this is maybe for people that like their cool gadgets, because you can be out and about and you can record the bird and it'll try and ID it for you. So I know it's very cool.
Lexi's face then.
I was just about to say we kind of like need a sound hound, or
Yeah.
what's it called? The apps where you can
Yeah,
ask it
like
what music's
Deezer.
playing,
Is
but
it
for
Deezer?
birds. But
Yeah.
you've just told me
Yeah,
about
I was going
one.
to say, is it
There-
Deezer?
Yeah, so it's kind of like that. So you just record it in real time and it'll try and ID it for you. It doesn't always get
need
it
this.
right, but it has helped narrow down like, what it might be for me before, and then I've gone back with that kind of ideas in my mind and then listened to songs myself, to try and ID it. But there's also talking about
That's so cool.
particularly listening to bird sounds and trying to ID them. I've been started to watch a couple of YouTube videos, two channels that I've kind of subscribed to and that I found really really useful. They're two new channels actually, both by naturalists. One of them is called Lucy Lapwing, and she does birdsong lessons with Lucy Lapwing, it's called. And the second one is by naturalist and photographer Ben Porter, otherwise known as Bardsey Ben on Twitter, and his is called Birdsong ID. And both of those, I don't know, I think the way they describe birdsong is just really really useful. It's not seabirds at the moment, it's mainly just garden birds, but that's sort of kind of what I'm trying to get into at the moment. So yeah, those have been really really good.
Yeah, so I think having a look online, using technology, and then actually getting out and about and getting your ear in
Definitely.
is the best way. So on that, we've mentioned that you've seen seabirds in Manchester, which is amazing. And you've mentioned that you can see them on reservoirs and in canals and all sorts of different places. But where's your favourite place to go looking for seabirds?
I would definitely say my favourite place is South Stack, and that's mainly because I did my master's fieldwork there, but also because I don't know, I have fond memories, and it's just because of the sheer number of birds that the cliffs provide nests for. It's really, really hard to describe it, but there's nothing like being immersed in that seabird colony with the noises and even the smells, which I'm sure some people might not appreciate. But to me, those smells bring back really happy memories of just being there watching the birds. Um, I think, yeah, like I've said, there's common guillemots, razorbills, there's puffins. For those of you that really want to see puffins, I mean, when I was there, I showed somebody where a puffin was, and she said, "Oh, you've just ticked something off my bucket list," and she gave me a hug and got all excited. So I just love, yeah, there's just so many species you can see there, and I think it's home to about 9,000 breeding seabirds in the breeding season. Yeah.
That number just like, when you get that little body shiver, I was like, damn, that's a lot of seabirds. And I was actually going to say that, is it loud? Because I can't really remember. It's been a long time since I've been to South Stack, but like on a clear day as well, the kelp and the seals, and there's porpoise there. And I mean, once I left Wales, there was some killer whales that came by. So yeah,
Of course.
South Stack. And I mean, do we have extra special seabirds or extra special visitors that come to the UK? I know, being where you've been based when you're actually in Scotland, Mel, that sometimes we do get some random seals and walrus visiting, but is there any extra special seabirds that come by?
Yeah, there are quite a lot of weird and wonderful things that do visit the UK, but I suppose it does depend on who you ask, because quite a lot of people would say the extra special seabird for them would be the puffin, just because they're so charismatic and the vibrant colours. But I think if you ask me, it'd have to be the little tern. So these are very dainty birds. But the reason I say that is because it's the UK's rarest, one of the UK's rarest breeding seabirds, and I think there's about fewer than 2,000 breeding pairs left in the UK. I was actually lucky enough to see them on a family holiday when I was in Orkney, and they nest on gravelly beaches in small colonies. But I think that increases their sensitivity to disturbance because they're on the ground, on beaches where humans go quite a lot. And what I really, really liked about this colony that I went to go and see, although there were only 5 left, I think, when I went, is that lots of children from the local community had drawn posters and put up like warning signs with like hand-drawn pictures of the little terns, just to tell people that they're here, they're nesting. Please keep your distance. Don't go anywhere near them. And I thought that was really lovely to see.
I adore that level of community love. I think our coastal communities and their connection to the sea is just fabulous in the UK. And I love the idea of these small little posters from local kids reminding everyone to be respectful of the birds.
It was very, very nice to see. I think the more educated people are, and I think just maybe if you're living that close to them, they're really part of your home, really, because that's where you live, that's where you go out and walk. And yeah, so it's really, really nice to see that level of engagement with wildlife and wanting others to know that it's there and try and conserve it and look after it as well.
I'm overwhelmed by the cuteness of posters. The amount of times that we see stuff by like our young conservationists that are soon going to be taken over from all of us is just so wholesome and so ridiculously cute, and I love it so much. So yeah, is there anything else that you would like to talk about before we sign off? Because we are definitely wrapping up now.
I don't think so. I don't think I had anything else.
No, that's absolutely fine. So yeah, thanks for chatting to us today, and thank you listeners for listening. We hope you have an absolutely wild day.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, bye. Thank you for listening today. As always, we have been Wild About Conservation and you have been awesome. Please do leave us a review. We would really appreciate it, and we do read them all.
To keep exploring with us, drop us an email or find us on our socials. All the links are in our description and the show notes. If you enjoy our show and want to support us, we are also on Patreon. Just £1 a month, 25p an episode, will cover our creation costs, and anything above that we donate to charity. Thank you to those of you that are already helping us to keep creating.
Our chosen charity for this season are the British Divers Marine Life Rescue, who are an organisation dedicated to the rescue and well-being of all marine animals in distress around the UK. Donations will go to training teams of volunteers and maintaining specialised equipment that is vital for their work.
Don't forget to look out for our next episode next Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts. If we aren't there, do let us know.
And remember, step outside and get wild about conservation. Bye!
How do you get wild?
Watching wildlife documentaries.
Wildflower painting.
Diving.
Wild swimming.
Ocean watching.
Rock climbing.
Bird watching.
Listening to podcasts.
Hill walks.
Visiting a wildlife charity.